David Nolan, welcome to the Soccer Queens podcast.
Pleasure, Erica. Thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm glad you reached out to me and we connected. I know that we connected through the Irish S&C network and just some great work that you're doing on the menstrual cycle front, and you have some recent research that's coming out, so we're going to dive into that today. But for those listening who don't know who you are, if you can just go into your background and what you're up to currently.
Sure. I suppose the term that we call ourselves now are academics is the term, this idea of practitioner academic, but in the last few years, much more on the academic side of things. So I came from sports science background, undergraduate in sports science from University of Limerick. After I graduated from there, I was working in strength and conditioning roles across various sports, and predominantly in Gaelic games here in Ireland, combat sports, and also then in rugby. Um, in terms of the academic side, I worked in kind of research before heading across to Dublin City University, where I have just finished my PhD, where I looked at sex differences in S&C physical preparation considerations through the lens of women's rugby. So essentially trying to answer this question of, well, do female rugby players need to train differently to males? And exploring this kind of question and some of the ideas around the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptive and how they may potentially impact performance. So just completing that PhD, well, I've submitted and I've Viva now in 2 weeks. But in terms of my career, I'm taking up a new role as assistant professor of strength and conditioning at Dublin City University. So hoping to expand the lab there and build out that research in the coming years, because I had a lot of lab-based stuff planned throughout the PhD, but COVID came in the way, and all of a sudden we weren't allowed to have people in the lab and different issues there. So a lot of my research had to switch to more qualitative kind of survey, interview-based stuff, meta-analyses, using of already existing data sets. So I'm looking forward to hopefully doing some lab-based studies with female athletes in the coming year and try to better understand how we can better train and prepare our female athletes.
Brilliant. So let's start general. And you mentioned that you're trying to figure out within your research, should females train differently than males? And that's actually a question I get a lot from coaches that I talk to and work with. And also, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are really curious. So, what have you found?
So that's a very common question, and it's logical. So when I think about that question, the very first thing I ask, well, is there a difference between males and females? We have to understand. And the simple answer is yes. We know that there's large differences on average between the average male and female in physiological systems, and a range of different systems in the body. So this results on average, if you have a typical male and female athlete, untrained or trained individual, the males on average are going to be stronger in terms of the absolute muscle strength. They're going to have more muscle mass. The bones are going to be longer, stronger. Tendons are going to be able to absorb higher forces. Now, this is kind of what some people would call the male advantage in sports. There's a paper from Tommy Lundberg and Emma Hilton where they coined this the male advantage. And it shows that on average, if you look at sporting performances for males and females, there's between, 5 to 10, up to 40% differences in the performance. I'm not a huge fan of the term male advantage. I prefer just it's a difference, because, we're not, it's not about saying, oh, well, male athletes are superior to female athletes. That's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm just trying to say there is a difference. Because if you acknowledge that there is a difference, well, then logically you start to think, well, if there's a difference between male and female athletes in terms of their physiological systems, their anatomical structure, and the sporting performances, and the majority of research in applied exercise science has been done in males over the past few decades, and a lot of the theories that we train athletes with comes from what we call androcentric or male-focused research, well, then there might be a need to train females differently. Why do we assume that females are just going to adapt the same way to exercise compared to the males? So that's the very first thing that I start to think about. And it becomes logical, well, then maybe females do need to train differently. But when we dig into the research and I start to think about, well, you start to ask yourself, do males and females then adapt to resistance exercise or strength and conditioning differently to one another? We don't have huge evidence to say that to do. When we look at resistance exercise training, we tend to see that when equated for lean body mass, when you take in the differences, if you know there's a 30 or 40% difference at baseline between males and females in terms of their muscle mass, well, when you look at the relative rate of increase in strength and muscle gain in response to exercise, it's rather similar. Yes, males gain absolutely greater amounts, but when it's standardized to the baseline body mass, you don't see a huge difference. So, a 10% increase for a male on bench press who has a 1RM of 100 kg, he will gain 10%, which will be 10 kg. The same 10% for a female athlete with a 50 kg 1RM goes up to 55, so 5 kilo. So you could look at the absolute difference there. Well, men gain twice as much as women. But when you standardize it to the baseline, it's similar. So we tend to see these similar responses in both lower body strength and muscle mass increases. There actually might be an advantage in females in terms of their ability to increase upper body strength greater than the effect sizes we see in males. And we're not fully sure why that is, if it's an artifact of the study design, differences in the baseline physical activities of untrained individuals, but there is something there. So we see that they respond rather similarly. But we do see in, say, cardiovascular exercise, males tend to respond a bit better to the same given dose of aerobic based exercise compared to females. We have this sexual dimorphism that we call it. Now, that's on average. We don't deal with, the average person who would say, yeah, I am the perfect example of what is average. We see huge heterogeneity of response, so variation in response. We all know that when we work with people. We give people the same program. Some people respond really well, some people respond not the way we'd hope, and most people, have average results. So males and females, there's huge variation between the responses we see. So just because males and females might respond a bit differently in response to certain exercise, that variation is actually really large within the sex itself. So females all respond very differently, males all respond very differently. So that's the second layer. Like, okay, there's no great differences in responses to exercise, and then you start to say, well, what do we modify as coaches? And you can go to the basic side of thing of the fit principle. So frequency, intensity, time, type, and frequency. You can say, okay, there is some anecdotal and empirical evidence say that females might be able to better handle higher frequencies of exercise, especially in resistance training. But I'd make the argument of, well, is it because there's something different between the sexes that females are able to handle it? Or is it because the absolute load is just a bit less on average for the females that, if we see elite level power lifters, male or female, and they're, squatting 200-300 kilos, that might be 80% of their 1RM, but that is a very different fatigue effect than someone that has an 80 kg, 80% 1RM. So there could be a sex difference, or there could be an absolute load difference. Intensity, again, for me, I can't see a big difference. People would say, oh, females anecdotally are better at higher reps, lower intensity, lower percentage 1RM. But that's irrelevant because the adaptation you're trying to achieve, just because someone is better suited to something, that doesn't mean that that's the adaptation you want to chase. If I'm really good at doing bodyweight squats, but I want to increase my 1RM, I'm not just going to do bodyweight squats and hope that it increases 1RM. You still bring it to the individual. So I'm rambling now, but I'm going to bring it together. Don't worry. So then you're talking about, time, type of exercise, and people will say, well, should females do different types of exercise? When you look at some of the consensus paper on trained female athletes, especially around ACL reduction, the recommendations come out and the consensus statement will say, female athletes should do a comprehensive neuromuscular exercise training program focusing on lower body strengthening exercises and usually landing mechanics and plyometrics, which is true. That is a very solid recommendation. Would you make a different recommendation for a male athlete? No, that's just a recommendation for all athletes. Get the body strong and focus on potential known injury risks. So for me, I can't see a strong argument why you would have a difference between male and females in any of those, because when you write a training program for an individual, I have a 3-step approach that I tend to conceptualize it. The very first thing you want to understand is, well, adaptation is the very first thing. what is the adaptation we're trying to achieve? That's not sex specific. Hypertrophy is hypertrophy, strength is strength, whatever it may be, that adaptation is the same. The next thing, once you're clear on what adaptation you want to try elicit, you're asking yourself, well, what principles must be put in place to drive that adaptation? Again, there's no sex difference. Progressive overload is progressive overload. Specificity is specificity. So then you come down to the bottom and you're like, once you know what adaptation you want, what principles must be in place, your last question is, well, what methods do I use that applies the principle that drives that adaptation? And that's where you can ask yourself, your methods are what you manipulate as a coach, and that's frequency, intensity, volume, and exercise selection. I can't see a strong argument how any one of those things at a blanket recommendation level needs to be different between males and females. Because for me, when you get down to that method level, that's based on the needs analysis of the individual athlete along with the individual sport or along with the sport that they play. So is sex a factor to consider? Yes, it is. If you're doing a needs analysis, you will say, oh, my athlete is female, therefore I need to be potentially more cognizant of the increased ACL risk, potentially aware of the systemic differences in the support pathways that are in place for that athlete. Because if I have an 18-year-old rugby player, male versus female, chances are the male player has been better supported in the long-term athlete development from early schoolhood, and they probably have more technical ability in the gym compared to the young female rugby player who probably hasn't got the same support structures through her youth development. So I need to be aware of these things, but sex is only one factor I need to consider in the needs analysis. It's not the factor I need to consider. So yes, I think we should be aware of sex as a potential variable we need to be cognizant of when we're designing a program. But I just don't like the idea of, oh, you're a female, therefore females fit in this box when it comes to training. Because, and I find it ironic sometimes that people will say, women are not small men. We need to treat them specially and be cognizant of it. But then they'll at the same time turn around and say, oh, but because you're a woman, this is the type of training you need to do. Where no one says, because you're a man, this is the type of training you need to do. To be like, no, well, what are you trying to achieve? What is the sport? And what's the needs analysis say?
I love everything you just said there, and it makes a lot of sense that sex is not the only factor we should be looking at, and it's like if we're working with just a human in general, strength is strength, power is power, and I like that, like, what adaptation are we chasing for that individual and what are we trying to improve? So that exercise selection should be similar. Men can benefit from single leg exercises and landing mechanics, and so can women. So I absolutely love that. Now, as far as the menstrual cycle, this is another factor that comes into play as far as female athletes. What have you found and what are you seeing as the impact of the menstrual cycle on performance or training adaptations?
So this is straightforward and really complex at the same time. People will try to make a lot of complexity here, and it is complex. It's a rabbit hole we can go down. But when we look at the totality of the literature today, and there's some great researchers that have done some fantastic meta-analyses. So I'm talking to the likes of Kirsty Elliott-Sale, Kelly McNulty, some of these real titans, and Lauren Colenso-Semple out of McMaster, then as well has done some recent research it's excellent. But essentially, we know that the menstrual cycle, and again, I'm not going to go through the different stages, but in very simply, you can break it up into two broad phases. You have your follicular phase, which is the start, first half. You have then the luteal phase, second half, and you have ovulation in between, and you have menses or the period at the start of that. Now, you can break it up into 5 or 6 different sections if you want to really get into it, but we won't go too much into it. But when we look at the totality of literature, and there's been, I think, a good few meta-analyses at this stage, we've this interesting dichotomy we see in the literature is when you talk to female athletes and survey them and do the qualitative side of stuff, you get female athletes, a high percentage of female athletes reporting side effects of the menstrual cycle. And again, that list is very long, but we're probably all familiar with some of the common ones: bloating, cramping, abdominal pain, low back pain, fatigue, mood swings. So we see that a high proportion of females will report these side effects of the menstrual cycle. When you also ask them, do you think it impacts performance? A decent proportion will say, yes, I feel it negatively impacts my performance. So that is there. When we look then at the evidence of studies that have tried to examine the effect of the menstrual cycle phase on performance, so bringing people into the lab on different phases of the menstrual cycle, doing tests to see if there's a difference in performance, we don't have strong evidence to say that the menstrual cycle phase has any impact on performance. There may be, if you look at the Corsi Elliott Sale, who led that meta-analysis, they're seeing a potential trivial impact in this mid to late luteal. That follicular phase might be slightly better for performance than the luteal, but again, that's just not supported. It's the majority of the literature is moderate to low quality. It's not really the highest quality. There's some limitations around validating of the menstrual cycle phase and these different things. But what really you see is huge amounts of variability. You see this huge, what we have, inter and intra individual variability. So some women are really impacted by the menstrual cycle. It seems that yes, we see a big dip in performance. Some no issue whatsoever. But also we see cycle to cycle, someone this menstrual cycle mightn't feel there's any difference in the performance. They could be crippled the next menstrual cycle. So we see this huge variation between individuals and also between cycle to cycle. So when you think of the way we do research, we're trying to find, usually group level mean differences in performance measures. Well, when you've huge levels of variation between individuals and within individuals, it's very difficult to detect any difference there at a group mean level. Statistically, it's just very difficult to do. So this is the dichotomy we have: is female athletes experience negative symptoms. They tell us that they feel it impacts performance. We test them in the lab. Doesn't seem to be an impact upon performance. Now, that is a dichotomy. That is a bit of a phenomenon. There are some reasons why we could be seeing that. It could be down to statistical approaches. Maybe we need to look at looking at this idea of variability a bit more. It could be that any detriment performance, if there is any, mightn't be at the level of the muscle. It mightn't be neuromuscular. It might be some sort of neural drive issue we might be seeing, or it might be a perceptual thing that the muscles can still work the same way, but you perceive it to be harder at a different phase, the hormonal shift. And that's something we do tend to see, that the power output someone can do might be the same, but if you ask them, well, how difficult did that feel? The same output might feel harder in one phase than the other. And from a performance perspective, if something feels harder, well, then it is harder. This is not to say, oh, it's all in your head or anything like this. This is, if something feels harder, from a practical perspective, it is harder. So that's what we see, is this time of variation. Now, where does that leave us from an applied perspective? Well, it basically means that it's premature to give any blanket recommendations on saying, well, you should, in the follicular, you're going to be on fire as you're approaching the ovulation, you're going to be really strong, and in the luteal, you're going to feel a bit weaker, maybe take it easier. Well, some women feel brilliant in their follicular phase, yeah, and they feel stronger. Some feel like crap. Some women in their luteal phase feel like crap. Some women feel brilliant. So there is no one size fits all. So it's premature to give blanket recommendations. So when it comes to the menstrual cycle, what you can do at a practical level, it comes down to tracking your individual cycle, getting to know your individual cycle, and that's over a prolonged period, 3-6 months, noting down symptoms you may feel, level of bleeding, differences in bleed rate or flow rate. You have then any symptoms you feel, and you're trying to identify these patterns. And then obviously, if you have objective measures of performance, well, brilliant, and subjective measures of performance. But you're trying to identify patterns. You lay it out after a couple of months and you look to see if there's a pattern. There may not be any pattern to it, so don't try to automatically think there will be a pattern. But if you start to see a consistent pattern, well, then you can start to put in an individual coping strategy or adaptive strategy. If you're saying, oh, I seem to cramp up, a couple of days before ovulation, every month I seem to be cramping, but I also seem to see increased sweating at night, and especially night sweats or something. Well, then for that individual, you would say, well, maybe we need to be more cognizant of increasing our electrolyte and fluid intake between those few days because we know you seem to you seem to have increased sweating, so therefore that's an individual coping strategy. Or these days tend to be always you feel a bit more lethargic. Well, we can taper things down on those days or adapt them. That's the best we can do at the moment is learning individual cycle, long-term pattern. To give a blanket recommendation to say, you've 40 women in a room, this is how you all should train in the follicular, or this is how you should adapt. We're not there. And it's the same idea when we look at phase-based training. This idea of, increase the volume and intensity in the follicular phase, take it lighter in the mid-luteal. You had a paper out by Sung and colleagues was proposing that that follicular phased follicular emphasized training might lead to superior gains in strength and hypertrophy. And it's not really supported by the totality of the literature. Lauren, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a fantastic paper with Stu Phillips and Kirsty Elliott-Sale discussing that and several other meta-analyses that looked at this phase-based training in detail. And it comes down to the same issue in terms of it's this level of variation we see between individuals. There hasn't been any really long-term study that's looked at this phase-based training done really well, where it's actually confirming follicular phase through blood sampling, through and confirming ovulation through lutein measuring the LH surge. So I'm not ruling out phase-based training as a possibility for the future. It's something that when you look at a purely theoretical basis, you can make a logical argument for why it may be. But I think that's based on a textbook understanding of the menstrual cycle. If you look at that graph of the menstrual cycle in a textbook, you can make that argument. If you try to track 100 women's actual hormone profile and you try to draw that same graph, it would look like a doodle. Everyone is so different and it varies so much. So this idea of oh, you're a woman, therefore you have a textbook hormone cycle. That's it's just not there yet. That's very idealistic way of thinking. So in the future, we do need maybe a long-term study to look at phase-based training and its potential for improving the adaptive response. So I'm not ruling out the possibility, but based on the current body of evidence, it would be very premature to say that adapting your training around your phase menstrual cycle would lead to any superior benefits in terms of your adaptations you get from exercise compared to traditional training.
Now I see why you said this topic is complex, but it's also very general, and I really like the general side of it, and it seems like you're front-ending all these issues with proper nutrition and hydration strategies, and we should just be doing our strength and deceleration and speed training anyway as is. So I really like that, and I think that just really brings everything together. But as far as other recommendations for female athletes with taking oral contraceptives. That's another controversial issue. And I know you're researching this one a lot. So let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because when we talk about female athletes, people always jump straight to the menstrual cycle. And again, I argue, if we're really going to make the most difference for our athletes, focusing on the menstrual cycle and phase-based training, that for me is kind of that's the far end. I think the fundamental stuff hasn't been done. I make the argument if you want to really make a difference to our female athletes, we give young girls and adolescent girls the same support structures that the males have, and we encourage them to do the same long-term athlete development at youth sport that we see in male sports. But you're right. Everyone jumps straight to the menstrual cycle, but they forget that when we're talking about athletes with a menstrual cycle. That's athletes that have gone after menarche, so the onset of their first menses. So once they've hit puberty to menopause. So it's women that are premenopausal and also are after going through puberty. But if you take that group, about half of them probably don't have a menstrual cycle because they're using some form of hormonal contraceptive. So when we look at our own research we did in powerlifters and rugby players, showed a little over 50% of them are using one form of hormonal contraceptive. And when we look at all research across kind of athletes and general population, you're talking in athletic populations, probably 40 to 50+% of athletes are using hormonal contraceptive. The oral contraceptive pill being the most common of that in our younger athletes then as well. So we need to consider that if half our athletes don't even have a menstrual cycle, well, then we need to potentially be cognizant of that. So when we take, again, this is, and I preface this, I spend a lot of my time mansplaining the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptives to students and athletes, and I always have that slip of tongue when I'm like, when females take contraceptives, hormonal contraceptives, essentially what we're doing, we're putting an exogenous or a synthetic hormone into the body, and depending on what form you're taking, it can do a few different things. But mainly, what happens in most cases, you're going to see suppression of endogenous production. So your natural production of estrogen and progesterone is chronically downregulated, and you have these synthetic levels of an estrogenic component and a progestin component in a combined oral contraceptive pill coming in at a consistent level. Now, depending on how you use it, the traditional way would be 21 days on, 7 pill-free days, where a withdrawal bleed happens. Or some people will use the pill just continuously through and don't come with those pill-free days. So if you're come from the thought process of, well, estrogen, it's anabolic, progesterone is anti-estrogenic, and these fluctuations can potentially influence our strength and how we respond to exercise, well, then manipulating them with synthetic or exogenous hormones may have an impact upon performance and on adaptation to exercise. So acute response, again, Kelly McNulty led up the meta-analyses where they looked at, menstrual cycle, people with a normal menstrual cycle versus those taking oral contraceptive pills. And they found, again, similar to menstrual cycle, that there might be a trivial detriment in the oral contraceptive pill users. They might be slightly negatively impacted. But again, they were very cautious of that, finding it wasn't conclusive. There was no huge reason to say that the oral contraceptive pill had a massive impact on performance. And especially when you think of the reasons why people use the pill, obviously contraception is one of them, but people use it for many reasons. And one of those might be to deal with, PMS issues or menstrual related issues, where if someone is using it and because they use the pill, it means that they're not crippled for a week and taking a week out training every cycle, well, then it's probably having a net positive effect upon their performance there. But that's the acute performance. So what are our meta-analyses then? We asked the question, well, what about the long-term adaptations? If you are on the pill versus going through the cyclic hormones of eumenorrhea, a menstrual cycle, is there a difference in how you adapt to resistance training in terms of strength, power, and hypertrophy, muscle gain? So it's been accepted to sports medicine. It should be published hopefully in the next week or two, be out in print. But essentially, when we looked at that, we came up with 8 different studies, 8 different papers that had looked at these questions that directly compared oral contraceptive pill users to those with a natural menstrual cycle. Now, what I should say is we were looking for hormonal contraceptive users. As a general, we tried to find them all. Studies have only looked at the pill. People have not looked at other forms of hormonal contraceptive. So it's only the pill I'm speaking about here. And based on our evidence, we have shown that based on the current body of evidence, there is no difference on hypertrophy, strength, or power outcomes in response to match resistance training, whether you're on the pill or having natural menstrual cycle. So that is say from a practical perspective, there is no reason to advocate for or against the use of the pill when it comes to increasing strength, muscle size, or power when following resistance training. Now, with everything, there's a few nuances and caveats. We probably would like to see that's the average study duration was a little over 12 weeks. If there is a difference, it may take longer for it to manifest, especially in something like muscle growth, which is a long-term process. We do see then studies are combining groups of people using different forms and different generations of the pill. So, there's second, third generations and have different pill brand names, so different dosages of the estrogenic component then as well. So when you group those all together, you potentially are missing some of the mediating effects of these different ones. So like everything, there is more research needs to be done to fully tease out and examine this question. But if anyone is saying, oh, the pill impairs your ability to grow muscle, or the pill, enhances your ability to get stronger, all those any recommendations of whether you should or should not use the oral contraceptive pill for exercise is premature at this stage. The evidence is not there to support the direction either way. It shows at the moment a neutral finding that the pill, based on the current evidence and analysis, doesn't impact strength, hypertrophy, or power outcomes.
Now, is there anything in the research saying that the pill would be good for a female athlete who has an irregular period or a painful period, or should we be recommending lifestyle changes and allowing them to make an informed decision? Because I see a lot of coaches recommending you got to go on the pill right away, which is like, okay, well, we're only giving them one solution. So, what have you found with this?
Again, that's a tricky area because for me, I don't think that's within the coach's remit to make a recommendation of whether someone goes on the contraceptive pill or not, because that's a deeply personal choice. In terms of as a coach, you know what I mean? If we ask someone to, in another context, here, you need to put these hormones inside your body. This is, if you say that to a coach, do you think it's okay for you to tell your athletes to put these hormones in their body? I don't think any coach would say yes unless they're, in some sort of doping program. But for some reason, some coaches feel it's okay for them to recommend a pill. And again, when we talk about scope of practice, the only one that can make that kind of recommendation is a medical professional that's suitably qualified to make that recommendation. And again, that would be a recommendation. It wouldn't be an order to an individual. They would suggest it as a potential issue, because we do see that a high prevalence of menstrual cycle disorder and symptomology in athletes and symptoms. Now, when we look at the anecdotal evidence, you talk to some people about, well, the motivations to use the contraceptive. Many times it is, to deal with PMS issues or menstrual related symptomologies. They found when they went on the pill that they had an alleviation of those symptoms. Conversely, you see a lot of people go on contraceptives and it causes symptoms. Like the contraceptive itself is not side effect free. Our paper also showed that a high proportion of female athletes on hormonal contraceptives report side effects of them as well. Many of them that are matched to menstrual cycle related ones, there's similar enough ones. So, and people will often use different forms of hormonal contraceptive to find which one suits them best. So, and then the other reason why a lot will say to use the contraceptive is to control menses, to control their period. Especially we see it in maybe some endurance athletes will often say, rowers I know will say, they're out in the boat for a couple of hours. It's just easier for them to be able to control that kind of things. It's more convenient for their training. So again, and I probably want to be an example of it here, I would never make a recommendation either way, because one, I don't think that it would be appropriate to do that. And two, as a sports scientist, a strength and conditioning coach, an academic, I'm not qualified to do so. That is, I'm not a medical professional. PhD is not MD. So I can say this is what the evidence says, but you have to respect scope of practice. And I think coaches need to be very aware of their scope of practice. If they have an athlete that is suffering menstrual issues, and whether that's menstrual dysfunction or irregularity or menstrual related symptomology or side effects, your job as a coach, a sports coach, or an S&C coach is not to deal with that. That is something this is why we've interdisciplinary teams. That is where you talk to the team doctor. It's where you refer out to someone that is qualified to deal with that. Now, I'm all for sharing resources and everything like that, but I will never sit down with a female athlete and ask them, okay, tell me what's wrong. I think go away and get yourself the oral contraceptive pill. I can make the recommendation of, I think you need to go speak to a doctor and see what they think, but I don't think it's in our scope of practice to make those type of recommendations. I don't know what you think about that, Erica.
Oh, I 100% agree, and I've seen a lot online from coaches and even parents chiming in on this topic about menstrual cycle dysfunction and, "Oh, just go on the pill," and I'm like, "Okay, first of all, like, you're not a qualified professional or MD. Second of all, there's other options that we should inform female athletes about, that there's not only one way to make your period regular or have less painful periods. So that's really important. And I do want to leave coaches and even parents who are listening to this with just some actionable items, because a lot of adults will be like, okay, well, should I talk to a group of adolescent athletes about the menstrual cycle? Do I even need to bring it up? Or should I just be providing them with resources to become stronger, to become more nourished, to learn about recovery and sleep strategies? Like, do they even need to bring the cycle up, especially if it's a group of younger girls? I have my opinions on this, but I'm curious what you've seen and what you've done in your practice as well.
Yeah, this is something that my thought process continually evolves on, because as coaches, what we tend to do is when we learn about something, we get really excited about it, and then we want to tell everyone. And whether that's a new training method or something, we're trying to do it, implement it how we can. So just because you're working with female athletes, as I said, sex, female physiology, it is one factor that needs to be considered. It is not the ultimate factor. So the whole thing doesn't become about the menstrual cycle. You know what I mean? You don't create your whole environment around menstrual cycle, menstrual health, and this kind of stuff. Your sports coaches, your fundamental job is to um, work with them and develop their sports skills and their athletic ability, or as a strength and conditioning professional, develop their athletic ability in those different ways. That being said, is it important that I think it's important that you foster an environment that athletes are comfortable in talking about it if they want to. Some athletes don't want to discuss their menstrual cycle, and that is perfectly fine. I don't like when it is forced upon everyone's like, oh, you need to do this. If you're working in a high performance environment, you're working with a senior adult team, high performance, and every little factor needs to be considered. Well, then where we're using these apps and we're monitoring menstrual cycle across um, these apps and readiness systems, that's a different argument, I think. And again, with data collection, data is only useful if you're actually going to do something with it. If you're asking people to fill out a load of information about their menstrual status and track it every day, but they don't see you actually doing anything with it, well, that's a very quick way to lose the trust of your athletes, and get them frustrated. But when we're working with younger and adolescent girls, as same with adolescents, boys, it's a time of great change and it's a difficult period in people's lives. You know what I mean? As adults, we can look back and be like, okay, the problems weren't that serious when I look back on it now. I wasn't having that hard of a time. But in their world, it's a very difficult time that they're going through. Some athletes, and again, I've worked with a load of female athletes, some will talk about the menstrual cycle very comfortably. Some don't want to discuss it with male or female coaches, and that's perfectly fine. But I think to make the environment that, I'm aware of it, it's a thing, let's not make a big deal of it. And again, most female athletes I've worked with, they don't think it's a big deal. It's the coaches that make a big deal out of it in terms of, what I mean, if you make this big song and dance and you stand up, it's like, just to let you know, I'm comfortable talking about your menstrual cycle and everything like this. That's just weird. That's just a bit odd. It's like, make it in passing, but create an environment that is open. And how do you do that? Well, make sure the bathroom has enough facilities, that there are pads, tampons, or whatever it may be, that you have the environment is okay. This sport environment acknowledges that the menstrual cycle is a real thing, and you can do that. And you have, I think it's good to have a female practitioner in the environment as well, because certain females will only feel comfortable talking to another female. That's perfectly fine. But for me, as I create an environment that is open, I acknowledge it. And again, it kind of comes to my territory. Anyone that follows me on social knows that any of my athletes know that's kind of what I do. But for anyone else, you acknowledge it, but you don't make a massive deal out of it. You just say, oh, if anyone's having any issues, just let me know. And if you need to step out for whatever reason, no panic. So that people are comfortable. When it comes to educating then athletes, I'm all for, having a workshop on it, having an educational series. How we frame that education is quite important though, because, and this is something I'd like to replicate, there was some research in the 80s that looked at whether you frame the menstrual cycle positively or negatively. And if you come in and you start saying, you're going to feel crappy around your period. This is how you're going to be negatively impacted. So we can deceive our athletes, or we can start to have a self-fulfilling prophecy where an athlete is telling me, next week I'm coming up to my period, so my squat's going to be down a bit. And I'm like, oh, how do you know it's going to be down? It's like, you're already expecting it to be down. That's an expectancy effect. Whereas if you frame it positively, and you don't just focus on the negative, we see that you're actually far less likely to report negative symptoms in the menstrual cycle. Now, that's just one study. I'd like to see it replicate, but again, how we frame things is important. So that we're not telling people, you're a woman, so this is how you'll feel in your luteal phase, and because you're a woman, this is how you'll feel in your follicular phase. You can say that this is what some people feel, but really getting this message, it's all individual. Some people will feel like this, some people won't. So it's about getting to know your own cycle. So for me, I'm all for the education, but I think don't make the whole environment about, oh, just because we've a female team here, everything needs to be about the menstrual cycle. No, it's one factor, we acknowledge it, but we don't go overboard on it. Because again, if you make this hyper awareness around it, well, then people do start to feel, it's like people when they start wearing hoops all of a sudden, it's like they feel great, but then this device in their arm tells them, oh, you haven't recovered. Well, then they start to feel these niggles come in that they weren't going to feel otherwise. So we're very easy to convince ourselves into this nocebo effect. So again, I'm rambling once again, but educate them, but be very aware of, don't frame it that this is how you're going to feel. Just give broad, you can't give blanket recommendations. You can give the general information, but the whole environment can't just revolve around this, because I've had female players that I've seen report in different ways is everything shouldn't revolve around our reproductive system. You know what I mean? We're athletes and we're here to be, better athletes. There's more to us than just what our reproductive organs do.
You're speaking my language, David. I think this whole topic is just, it's a great opportunity to actually empower female athletes. And I always tell my girls, look, let your hormones work for you, not against. And if you have a good perception about it and you realize, okay, I can do things to have a healthy menstrual cycle and to perform at a high level, that really gives female athletes their power back. And I think there definitely is a psychological component to it. And I know the study you brought up on the bad perception of the cycle and how that can really impact. And I think more needs to be done there, but I think there's definitely something to that. And you're right that education really needs to be framed in a positive way, taking action with certain things in lifestyle. And that's when we can really help our female athletes with this. And we don't have to overcomplicate it really. So this has been just a really great discussion. I think a lot of people find it really refreshing. And I definitely want them to look at your paper that's coming out in a week, but probably it's out now after we release this. So I'll include the links. And is there anything else you want everyone to know as far as the work you're doing now or anything you offer?
I suppose just keep an eye on my own social media. So I'm at David underscore synapse on Twitter. And if you put in David Nolan strength on Google, I'll probably come up. Don't just put in David Nolan. There's some swimmer fella that seems to out Google me at the moment. But that kind of thing. And yeah, if anyone, is looking for any advice or has any research projects that they'd like to collaborate on, I'm more than open to those collaborations, because in terms of when we look at the female athlete research, the big issues we see is, small sample sizes, all this kind of thing, where we need to open up this collaboration. We need multi-site international collaborations if we're really going to start to understand more some of these more complex questions, especially, as I said, when we have so much variability between and within individuals. Small sample sizes just don't cut it. We need larger long-term studies.
So everyone be sure to keep an eye out for all of David's work and everything he's doing. I'll include all of his links in the show notes below, so please follow up with him, and we really hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you next time.